Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. Wow, it's been a busy week on the political front here in South Africa. A former deputy president passed on. Then you had that explosive press briefing by the KZN police commissioner on Sunday. And thereafter, Ramaphosa was at BRICS together with the other BRICS countries. And Donald Trump said, well, you guys, anti-American policies, 10% on all of you and anyone who dares to join you. And then we got a very kind of personalized email from the White House from Mr. Donald J. Trump saying, well, henceforth, exports from South Africa to the US, 30%. And if you try and play a game of increasing your tariffs on exports from the US to South Africa, then we'll add that very percentage onto the 30%. So, you know, I don't know. Sometimes when you see what Donald Trump does with these percentages and these tariffs, it kind of reminds me of when I was a kid, you know, when we used to play Monopoly and I used to just play around with the figures and the estimations and the values. One wonders if he's trying to play Monopoly with the world's economy. A lot has been said, coming back to the other story about the legacy of Didi Mabuza. Is he the guy that needs to be acknowledged for saving South Africa by throwing in his lot with the Ramaphosa faction rather than the NDZ faction at the first Nasrec in 2017? Is he the guy to be acknowledged for walking away from the vice presidency and not digging in his heels and insisting on contesting for the top job? Or is he the guy that should be remembered for all the allegations of not only corruption but even murder when he had a stronghold on the Mpumalanga province? We'll touch on that in more detail. And then coming back to the very first story, those explosive allegations, General Nkwazi, implicating the police minister, the National Deputy Police Commissioner, and basically telling South Africans what they already suspected, that the rot is deep within SAPS, and there's a very strong connection between high-ranking officials within the security cluster and the criminal underworld. So we're going to be unpacking these issues with Angelo Fick, a well-known political analyst, and he's also the head of programs at ASRI. Angelo, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the program. Thank you for your time.
Walaikum salam to you and to your viewers.
Let's start with the Nkwazi press briefing, right? And I want to just take it issue at a time. There are some overarching issues that have come to the fore. Breaking with protocol. There were those who were critical and said, well, whatever the case may be, you've got to raise these things internally. You can't have a high-ranking SAPS officer going to the public like this. It's too risky. Others are saying, well, a seasoned individual like him would have exhausted all internal options, or he would have known that, pursuing internal options wouldn't have resulted in much, and this was his last resort. What's your thought on this aspect of protocols, and that he could face consequences now for basically stepping beyond the framework of these protocols?
So one imagines there will be and should be consequences, and this has to do with what happens not just inside the South African police services, but inside the accountability mechanisms that the provincial commissioner would have to the provincial MEC, and there through to the minister at national level, and thereby to the presidency. One also wants to know whether those steps were followed, and if they were, what the consequences were, and also what consequences of oversight or what issues of oversight had been exercised at both provincial and national level around these so-called cancellations, the allegations of 121 charges withdrawn. What had the National Prosecuting Authority done? What had the Priority Crimes Division done? What was known at crime intelligence level at both provincial and national level around these issues raised by Lieutenant General Nkwazi? So that this isn't just about what is Mr. Ramaphosa now going to do, or what is the police minister going to do with an officer who basically stepped out of the rank and file and made these allegations, but leading up to this point, what were the steps followed? And that, I think, is crucially what President Ramaphosa may have concerns around, because once all of that information becomes public, the question will be, did the buck stop with him? And as the person deploying the Minister of Police, what had he done in response to this?
Now, the issue of suspensions or precautionary suspensions, right? I've seen this debate to some extent on some fora. There are those who say the police minister and Shadrack Sibiya, the Deputy National Police Commissioner, should be put on precautionary suspension. And this should not be seen as punitive. It should be seen rather as being proactive here. However, they caution that suspending Mkhwanazi would create the impression that you're now targeting whistleblowers. I suppose the fear is that if indeed these allegations are true, there could be processes underway already to do a cover-up before the president can get to start dealing with the issue.
That was my concern about what we were being told about the president seeing this as a threat to national security. If it is a threat to national security, those processes need to be immediately implemented, and we need to have some kind of public information through the parliamentary oversight process of what those processes are and what they're going to come up with. In a country in which we've had special investigative units, parliamentary commissions of inquiry, judicial commissions of inquiry on far less damaging allegations, I think it is time for the legislature to take its oversight role seriously and to begin not just at provincial level, but at national level to ask tough questions. Precautionary, probation or suspension may be issues for the deputy police commissioner, but I think something far more drastic has to be done at the cabinet level when it comes to the minister himself. We know that this is a president who recently fired a deputy minister for violating a travel permissions situation, but has not suspended 2 full cabinet members for allegations of implication in corruption, maladministration, and a variety of other misdemeanors. So it seems as if this is not a president who's keen to discipline his own cabinet, and particularly for members of his own party. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the political deployee, the minister, and what happens to the civil servant, in this case, the deputy police commissioner. And I think if there's a difference there, then there will certainly be questions about who is protected by belonging to certain parties and who is not. And if there's any action against, the Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi, the question will be, as you pointed out, what do we do with people who become whistleblowers, given that, 1, they risk their lives, and 2, they're now also risking their careers, because they become the people who must be dampened down, and the issues that they raise are not necessarily quickly and adequately investigated, addressed, and dealt with.
So, Angelo, before we get to the substance of the allegations, which is a very important discussion, let's talk about the politics of it, right? So, Senzo Mkhunu, if we go back to the first NASRAC, was part of the Ramaphosa slate. He was supposed to be the SG, and by a few votes he lost out to Ace Magashule. If my memory serves me correct, I think when they announced the results, there was actually a bit of a misunderstanding. And initially it was assumed that Senzo Mkhunu had won the SG's position before there was clarity on the matter. We know that factional battles are starting to intensify within the ANC as the Ramaphosa era now comes to an end. And perhaps Senzo Mkhunu was looking at occupying a high position. So the one argument could be that perhaps he's being targeted for political reasons rather than the substance of the allegations. And the other argument could be that if he's a political ally, then Ramaphosa may once again drag his feet, commissions of inquiries and processes that will drag on not for months or years until, the attention of everyone moves on elsewhere and he gets to protect his allies within cabinet. What's your sense and analysis of the politics here? Is it a case of career politicians like Mkhwanazi just not being able to gel, or rather career policemen not being able to gel with a boss who's not a career policeman?
It is possible that there is a direct conflict in people's aspirations, but I think it's also important to note that this is happening for the umpteenth time in the African National Congress's election cycle, that when there is a shift in leadership coming down the pipe, or the pipeline, what we see is maneuvering at political level, at the provincial level, to either discredit people or to make sure that they, for reasons of compromise, would rather step aside. The shifts that we saw around the movement of Mr. Mkhunu inside the African National Congress must be read against the background of the African National Congress's electoral collapse in KwaZulu-Natal in the last general elections last year and the rise of the MK party. So what we're suddenly seeing is how provincial dynamics in a province like KwaZulu-Natal, which once had the most number of branches and ANC membership, for the party in the country, is affecting not just national ANC dynamics, but now provincial governance dynamics and also national governance dynamics. And the inability to manage that process, or the political unwillingness to manage that process more appropriately since 2022, is precisely why we sit with a situation of having, police officers making press statements on a Sunday that implicate the highest oversight body in the country, members of parliament, implicate people deployed into cabinet, and the complex relationship between the Gauteng province, the KwaZulu-Natal province, in terms of not just, as these implications are, the National Prosecuting Authority and police officials, but even judges. And that, I think, is something that the president has to take very seriously, and has to have an investigative team on the ground very, very quickly, or the consequences will roll down and we'll start seeing or greater citizen distrust of institutions like the judiciary, like the police, and never mind the politics. And that, I think, should be a concern for Mr. Ramaphosa as President of the Republic, but also as President of the African National Congress, if he wishes to reverse that 40% performance in 2024.
The substance of the allegations, what do you make of it? I mean, we're hearing about alleged criminal kingpins having direct access to ministers, not only the current minister, but even previous ministers, and sleepovers and the like. Just this morning now, the Minister of Police, Senzo Mkhunu, seemingly walking back what he told Parliament previously, that he never knew an individual. Now he says, well, I know him more as a comrade, but not really as a personal acquaintance, if I could paraphrase it in that way. What you making of, what's your sense of what has come to the fore thus far in terms of the allegations and the kind of very minimal responses, because the president has somewhat put the brakes on it and said everyone should exercise restraint until I get back and decide what to do?
Yes, restraint for processes that unfold in living time is going to be very difficult. So I'm not certain of Mr. Ramaphosa's strategy on this issue. But I think what it reveals is how many of these senior ANC people, but also people deployed into cabinet, and they're not just from the ANC, seem to live in a world as if it's still 1986, as if we don't have the internet, as if people don't have access to information dissemination, as if they have control over the way in which information can be released into the public, or can be distributed and disseminated amongst members of the public. So that, I think, speaks to the tragedy of once you make statements, it's very difficult to move back on them because they're now recorded and in the public domain. And we've seen this going back all the way to Alec Erwin and his remarks on whether he'd said something to Deborah Patta the day before about sabotage at the nuclear power station in Cape Town. We've certainly seen it with Brian Molefe when it came to tracking where people's mobile phones were in the 2014-2013 period. And we're now seeing it again, where people who should know better about the way in which technology can be used to track and record them, as particularly the Minister of Police, seem unaware of just how much can be recorded, how much can be proven. And again, given the compromises in crime intelligence that are at the basis of this particular set of allegations, one wonders whether, again, the African National Congress and the president of that party as president of the Republic is deploying the best people into cabinet who understand the space that they're working in and what it is that they do, and how their statements can be so easily recorded and played back at them, or their relationships can be easily uncovered by the use of technology. And so these statements that they're simply a comrade and I didn't know them, that I don't think is going to wash if there is evidence to the contrary. And the implication certainly is that there is evidence of at least interactions between members of the cabinet, members of the police structure, and people who are alleged to be organized criminals.
Lastly, on this aspect of what we discussed today, this topic, right? What's your analysis of the public reaction? On the one hand, you could see on social media, at least on platforms like X, that Mkhwanazi was lauded and applauded, and people said, this is a man who's not, kind of initiated a proper national dialogue, not that the one Ramaphosa and Mbeki want to spend 700 million on. This is a hero. He needs to be protected. He's putting his life on the line for the sake of South Africa. On the other hand, people have been raising the issue of a deepening distrust within the citizenry of the police. We know that in our democracy, I suppose, we kind of first got introduced to this illicit and illegal link between those in the highest echelons of security in our country and the criminal underworld, with the whole Jackie Salibi saga that played out eventually in court and in a conviction. How do you analyze the public perception around these things?
So I think this will only worsen the public distrust of institutions in this society. We've seen a downturn in the trust of institutions across the board, whether it is the institutions of governance and administration, the institutions of policing and justice, or even the institution of the media itself. We've seen real concern around people believing individuals over institutional mechanisms because of the way in which we've compromised so many of those institutions. So my concern would be that people who are already feeling distrustful of the rule of law and the way in which processes should work will probably find this as yet another indication that says that these institutions are so compromised that, one, they cannot be trusted, and this may begin to be used as mechanisms or explanations for why, for example, police officers who investigate these issues are often killed. One thinks of the police officers in Bishop Lavis, one thinks of the bodies of those police officers found in the car that had gone missing for a while. One thinks of the everyday criminality that police officers face on the ground. And then the corruption and maladministration in those spaces, which now, is just going to further, cause distrust for people when they go into ordinary police stations or when they have to rely on the police to deal with issues that arise in their communities. And that, I think, is not a situation that the current government of National Unity Coalition would want to encourage, because it would take us back a generation to a time before the end of apartheid, when the majority of South Africans knew not to trust the police because it was not necessarily an instrument of justice or an instrument of fairness, but an instrument of oppression. And here it cannot become an instrument of further corruption, and therefore it becomes important to handle, as you've indicated, the process slightly better than we did in the Jackie Selebi issue or in the 15 years since then, to make sure that we don't have greater distrust in a population that's already atomized and does not feel that they belong to the state or that the state is under their control.
Moving on to the legacy of the former Deputy President of the Republic and of the ANC and former Premier of Mpumalanga, Didi Mabuza. I did mention in my introduction that if you look at some of the commentary, right, there are those who feel, and that's primarily coming from his comrades within the ANC, that we acknowledge him for the role that he played in NASRAC, the whole unity ticket concept. We acknowledge him for walking away very peacefully from the Deputy President's position and for going into political retirement in the proper sense. He was not critical of the party, he didn't interfere, he went out, he campaigned. Good comrade, and we've got to acknowledge him for that. I saw a Zapiro cartoon the other day that ran with the caption that we don't speak ill of the dead, but in this case we will. And that's the whole other aspect of Didi Mabuza, all the allegations of corruption and even murder whilst he was at the helm of the province. I suppose his supporters would argue he was never charged, let alone convicted. So we've got to cut him some slack there. Now that a person has passed on, when you look at political legacy, what's on the table, what's off the table, and how do you kind of conclude?
I think we need to recover from these sentimental ideas that we don't speak ill of the dead. We need to take people's legacies on in their complexity, because we have a society riven with problems that were created by people and their actions, and by organizations and their tolerance for individuals and their actions. Mr. Mabuza had a very complex legacy, not just at provincial level, but also at national level. At the provincial level, the allegations of manipulations of government resources to grow a party inside Mpumalanga, which went from, just another province in the ANC's panoply of provincial holdings to the second largest province inside the ANC, which is odd given that Gauteng is a much more populous province, but I think that also signaled the shifts inside the ANC. There are also the allegations that he was using those, government processes in order to engage people, to attract people into the party through what are called kickback processes, whether they were KFC meals or whether they were large public construction contracts. These allegations remain. They were never tested, never dealt with, and that also speaks to the compromise of state institutions. For too long, we rely on this idea that we should respect people because they've died. when the consequences of their actions when they were alive remain with us. Rereading Didi Mabuza's actions inside the 2017 and 2022 ANC conferences, because the consequences look like they were positive. Mr. Ramaphosa came to power in the party, is I think to forget just how there was a complicated Premier League process involving Ace Magashule, and the Northwest Premier at the time. So we're sitting with a situation where we need to look back at those details and not read them only in relation to the positive outcomes of what we imagine to be the positive outcomes, but what they reveal about power in the ANC at that time and the corruption of branch membership, the corruption of party structures, and the will to power and the desire for control over the resources that that power gave you access to. The Didi Mabuza failed to realize. It wasn't just that he saved the party, that he, in the end, could not get a second deputy presidency, that he was the first deputy president of the party in post-apartheid South Africa to not get the presidency, but had to leave the process for Paul Mashatile to step in, and that the province of Mpumalanga has all sorts of problems as a result of his premiership, and that does not go away. This is, after all, the province in which trade union membership in one of the most important industries, coal mining, is down. We know that this is a province that contributes significantly to South Africa's carbon footprint. We know the health consequences of people who live next to those coal power stations. This is the province in which power stations themselves were at the heart of failure to complete on time, Kusile Medupe, the inability of those provinces, of those projects to deliver the power which was implicated in the load shedding that we've had for a decade and a half. All of that doesn't go away simply because somebody has died, and we feel sentimental about the positive contributions that we imagine that this person has made. But we need to look at their political legacy, not just at the provincial level, but the consequences that has had for the national level. And we all seem to have forgotten, Mr. Mabuza was a major figure in Zuma's rise, Mr. Zuma's rise into the presidency of the ANC and into the presidency of the country. And so if we want to be critical of that decade, we need to be critical of all the people who were implicated in that mid-2000s shift from Mr. Mbeki to Mr. Zuma. And that includes Mr. Mabuza and the role he played as somebody who enhanced the African National Congress in Mpumalanga through means that are not always, transparent and obviously clean, in order to bring Mr. Zuma to the ANC presidency and thereby to a decade-long presidency of the Republic of South Africa.
So on that point about rereading some of what happened in Nasrec, the first Nasrec 2017, and subsequent to that leading into, Nasrec 2022, was it? What I saw, one analyst bring up this aspect that people are kind of acknowledging Mabuza for going the Ramaphosa route rather than NDZ and saving the country from a perpetuation of the Zuma, kind of leadership and Guptas and whatever else went with it. But there are others who came out and said, well, look, he didn't do it for the sake of the country. There were already rumblings within the Premier League circles that NDZ herself was not comfortable with him as a deputy. And that's why he threw in his lot with Ramaphosa, because he was just trying to secure himself the position of deputy president. And from being so strong, pretty much the kingmaker in 2017, what happened that led him to the point, as you mentioned, that he couldn't get a second term as deputy president, let alone become president?
Absolutely. And what we also sit with here is he had health challenges from the mid-2010s onwards. So in 2014, 2015, allegations that he'd been poisoned, all those trips to Russia, medical leave that ended up being a month long, that was never fully explained. When confronted about this in Parliament, the then Speaker of Parliament shut down the questioning about whether he'd been poisoned and what the nature of his healthcare in Russia had been. And basically, he was the catalyst that caused the collapse of the so-called Premier League by stepping away from the Northwestern Free State premiers, and thereby collapsing Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma's attempt to shift the presidency away from Mr. Ramaphosa. And we now read that, and at the time also read it as being a continuation of the Jacob Zuma presidency. But that's not entirely clear that would have been the case, because subsequent historical events may have shifted that. This is also, we had a pandemic in 2020, how such a presidency under Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma may have responded is different. And she herself shifted to be in Mr. Ramaphosa's cabinet and was a key figure in that crisis that emerged in 2020 in bulwarking the state against further collapse under economic and health crises. So my sense is Mr. Mabuza is a complex figure. There will be positives in the way in which we read him, but I think he was also the catalyst that collapsed that Premier League, which was seen to be a continuation or an attempted continuation of the Zuma presidency. But as the deputy president tasked with government business, that's a legacy that I think is also deeply compromised. And I think his weakness in not just national politics, but eventually in provincial politics, may have seen his removal and what became an abdication in essence, and a retirement into the quiet of politics. And that may also have been in relation to his health, which is a private matter that I think he kept to himself and never revealed what that was, and to what extent that may have compromised his ability to do the political work of Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa.
Now, the third issue that we want to unpack with you, Angelo, is Donald Trump. 30% to certain countries, or the template was the same, but the percentage varied between South Africa and some of the other countries that received that letter. 10% if you're part of BRICS, because it's anti-American. We've been seeing this ding-dong to and fro with Trump now for a couple of months, not from not too long after he came into the White House. That time, he had Elon Musk by his side. There was assumptions that perhaps Musk, because of his pursuit of prospects for Starlink in South Africa, was perhaps prompting him and instigating him. They have now had their spectacular fallout. He seems to be continuing to target South Africa amongst many other countries, and saying that, all of you have been taking advantage of America, and now we need to level the playing fields. How much more can South Africa negotiate here? And what are South Africa's options?
So I think Donald Trump, and I'm here using the insights provided by somebody like Yanis Varoufakis, the economist and former Greek finance minister, who suggests that a lot of this is an attempt by Donald Trump and his supporters to have manufacturing and industry return to the United States, because it had been gutted of that, and that we see in the unemployment figures for the United States, which for a first world industrialized state is quite poor. Also, that the United States had relied on the outsourcing of its manufacturing to spaces like China, like India, and other states. So when Donald Trump is moving against BRICS, it's interesting that that does not necessarily imply a move against Russia. It does not imply, because he's negotiating special deals with China. And India is in a fraught position as a US ally in the Indian Ocean, but as a trade ally with countries that include countries currently under attack or had been under attack by the United States, and that's Iran. So the question that I think that South Africans have to ask themselves is, to what extent is this emerging, quite fluid global environment, not just militarily, but in terms of trade and political alliances, going to be a messy period? And the South African state and its government will have to constantly negotiate shifts. And I think South Africa is a test case for the United States yet. The last time Donald Trump announced flat on 180 countries rate, sort of tariffs, there was a massive collapse in US economic trade on Wall Street. And as a result, he climbed down very, very quickly. I think in doing this in stages, he's testing what will be the market response when you do it with economies implicated in the global economy, like South Africa's, but not necessarily at the peak. And then can you begin to extend that to larger economies? And that includes some of your European economic entities like Spain. And then what can you do with the EU as one of the larger blocs and more powerful economies on the planet? Because you're then testing, can you then move against China? And my sense is that this will be another climb down, because his 90-day moratorium on those tariffs that he announced earlier that caused the collapse are, they're expiring very, very quickly in the next few days. And the question will be, what will he do? And I think he and his advisors are looking at how markets respond to what he does with South Africa and a couple of other economic players in the global economy who are smaller fry or medium fry, so that if there is no response by the US markets, he's likely to then move against the more powerful players to see whether that, the process of the response to an economy like South Africa, applies to an economy like Brazil, an economy like China, And I don't think that that's going to happen. I think there's going to be another climb down at some point, maybe not in relation to South Africa, but certainly against BRICS, because that is a growing, large economic bloc where the players don't necessarily, or the members don't necessarily agree. But in some respects, by constructing the US as the common outsider, he may be inadvertently constructing a unified, bloc between those players, much as had been done in the Cold War in the early days of the 1950s. So it's a fluid space. We don't know because things shift in the Trump administration from day to day, if not from hour to hour. And how the world responds will guide how South Africa responds, and how the US markets respond to the South African space will also determine how the Trump administration responds. They're about to go into their summer, so the height of summer, there's a sort of blank period. But as they move into winter, the kinds of needs that the US economy will have may see another climb down on these tariffs, because you don't just recall industrialization by imposing tariffs on your trading partners based on trade deficits. Trade deficits can be very, very good because that's just the nature of a globalized, integrated economy. And Mr. Trump is trying to, again, go back 150 years to an America that is not as implicated in the global economy as it became after the Second World War, and also in a space in which the rising of China and the shift, the role China plays in BRICS, may make his rhetoric about anybody who supports or joins BRICS being subjected to additional tariffs ring hollow when there are monopolies on precious metals, when he is engaged in wars and in military deployments that require scarce resources that increasingly go through China or through Chinese allies. And I think that this multipolar world that's emerging may become, once again, a bipolar world as we had in the 20th century, but not necessarily China versus the United States, but the United States against a panoply of other players that include the EU and China, because we've just seen the Chinese foreign minister visit the EU to strengthen ties between, the second largest economy on the planet and perhaps the emerging third largest economy on the planet. So I think South Africans have to just, like their administration, like the Ramaphosa administration, take it day by day, negotiate what they can, and deal with the fluidity, because this is not going to be a stable half century ahead of us.
To conclude then, right, on the note of Trump, Netanyahu is there on a visit. They're speaking again about relocation. Netanyahu is adamant there will be no independent Palestinian state. The talks are underway in Qatar, although news coming from Qatar seems to suggest that it still talks about talks and the framework. Hamas wants a permanent end to the war and the genocide, not just a 60-day ceasefire. What's your take on what's coming out of the White House thus far? What's Trump pushing for and why, and what's Netanyahu willing to give?
It's very murky looking at this. It's unclear to me that there is a stable linear position that says this is the solution. So at the rhetoric level, the argument clearly seems to be the Trump-Rivera example, which is that the Palestinians must simply disappear from Palestine, and that Israel will become the state de facto. And Palestinians, if they're not somewhere else, they're simply not part of the solution. And this had been, I think, projected as a concern by observers as far back as the 90s on the Oslo Accord. Someone thinks of it with Said's critiques of those negotiations in Oslo and the peace processes, or so-called peace processes then. What we've certainly seen in the last half decade and over the last 3 years and 2 years specifically is that the kinds of response one would have expected from the Arab world has not been forthcoming. That there are very odd relations in the Middle East between people who are senior NATO allies. One thinks of Turkey, who makes the rhetoric of they are disdainful of what is happening in Palestine and disapproving, but doing very little when NATO ships or NATO carrying flags are being intercepted by the Israeli military in international waters. As for the White House, because again, on everything else, the Trump administration seems to be quite fluid and quite, chaotic. I think Netanyahu should have concerns that any deal he makes with Mr. Trump may be reversible. and Mr. Trump may have concerns about any deal that he makes with the Israelis would be quite reversible, because since October 7, very senior hawks inside the American establishment, going back to the 80s, have commented upon the unreliability of the Israelis in these international negotiations. And again, the role that China plays in this is going to be crucial, because the last thing I think Mr. Trump or any of the even hawkish hawks in his cabinet would want is a military standoff with the People's Republic. And they've been saber rattling, but avoiding direct conflict precisely because they realize that that is not a positive outcome for them or for their ally in the Middle East, and that is the State of Israel. And so I suspect that the fluidity will continue, and Mr. Trump, having reversed his position several times just since he's come into office in January 2025, is likely to continue the uncertainty. And we'll see what happens as the Middle Eastern winter arrives in the second half of the year, whether the Israelis continue their annual shift summer to winter in their relationship with the Palestinians. And while we are tended to focus on Gaza, I think we should not take our eye off the West Bank and the predations that, Representative Albanese has certainly pointed out that are currently happening, involving official actors for the Israeli state simply standing by while settlers assault people in the West Bank. And shifts there, I think, are likely to see regional shifts that Mr. Netanyahu may think that he can take on, but may not necessarily be positive for him. A wider regional war is not something the United States can afford at the moment, but it may be a miscalculation on officials in the Trump administration, where we've also seen disagreement on their relationship with Iran, where intelligence in the US suggests that Iran is nowhere near developing a nuclear weapon, and Mr. Trump following Israeli intelligence rather than US intelligence in that regard. So again, who is the dog and who is the tail is entirely sort of unclear at the moment. But my sense is that neither of these two parties necessarily trust one another to the extent that to outsiders, it seems as if they do when they meet on the White House lawn.
Angelo, shukran so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
To the viewers, until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.